St. Thomas refuses to be confined by either. It answers instead to tide charts, ferry schedules, and the exact angle of the afternoon light. Here, cars drive on the left in a country where every other road runs right. Houses climb hillsides so steep that streets give up and become staircases, 99 steps, cut from ballast brick, still in daily use. Cruise ships deliver more visitors in a single afternoon than the island counts as year-round residents. There is no river on the entire island, and never has been. By the ordinary math of settlement, fresh water, flat ground, shelter from storms, this rock in the Caribbean Sea should be a way station, not a home. And yet families have lived here for generations, catching rain off their own rooftops, timing dinner to the sound of a bell buoy, teaching their children which hillside path, shortcuts, which switchback road. The question isn't whether people can survive on 32 square miles of vertical Caribbean stone. It's what they've learned about home that flatter, easier places never had to. St. Thomas sits in the northeastern Caribbean, one of three main islands making up the US Virgin Islands, an American territory closer to Puerto Rico than to Florida. The island covers roughly 32 square miles of volcanic ridgeline, rising to just over 5,500 feet at Crown Mountain, and is ringed by dozens of smaller cays and islets. Its capital and only real city, Charlotte Amalie, wraps around one of the deepest natural harbors in the Caribbean. Everything on the island, roads, neighborhoods, even conversations, tends to run uphill or downhill. Flat ground is the exception, not the rule. Picture an island slightly larger than Manhattan, stretched thin across the sea and folded into ridges instead of flattened into blocks. That's St. Thomas, about 32 square miles of land, home to roughly 42,000 people, down from over 51,000 a decade earlier, a shrinking population on a rock that was never large to begin with. There is no downtown grid here, no long straight avenue. Instead, there is Charlotte Amalie, the territorial capital, named in the 1600s for the Danish queen consort of King Christian V. Back when the island was a Danish colony, trading in sugar, rum, and, in the darkest chapter of its history, enslaved people brought across the Atlantic to work the plantations that once covered these same hillsides. What St. Thomas lacks says almost as much as what it has. No natural rivers or lakes, no railway, ever, no shopping mall in the American mainland sense, just a harbor town of pastel warehouses converted into duty-free storefronts. And in one detail found nowhere else under the American flag, cars here drive on the left-hand side of the road, a holdover from Danish rule that survived the 1917 transfer to the United States and never got corrected, even though nearly every vehicle on the island is a left-hand drive American import. Steering wheel and traffic lane, permanently out of sync. A small, everyday reminder that this is US soil that never quite stopped being somewhere else first. Politically, St. Thomas occupies a strange middle distance. Residents are US citizens, use US dollars, and serve in the US military, yet cannot vote for president and send only a non-voting delegate to Congress. The island runs as a free port, exempt from certain federal duties, which is why the harbor below Charlotte Amalie fills with cruise ships and jewelry shoppers almost every day of the year. a territory fully American on paper and only partially so in practice. The landscape closes the chapter better than any statistic could. From the ridge above Charlotte Amalie at dusk, the harbour turns to hammered copper, cruise ships lit up like floating hotels, hillside houses stacked one above another in reds, yellows and turquoise, their tin roofs catching the last light before the hills go the deep blue black of a Caribbean night falling fast, with no long twilight to soften the transition. Day simply ends, all at once, the way it does at this latitude. Before the story goes any further, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments below. Charlotte Amalie is not a city built to be driven through, it's a city built to be climbed. The old town hugs the waterfront in a tight grid of Danish-era warehouses, but almost immediately behind it, the ground tilts upward, and the town follows, spilling up 3 named hills: Frenchman's Hill, Denmark Hill, and Berg Hill, in switchbacks, alleys, and stone staircases worn smooth by 2 centuries of footsteps. Architecture here reads like a decision tree written in brick and paint. The harbourfront warehouses, once used to store rum and sugar bound for Europe, are built from thick masonry designed to survive hurricanes and now house duty free jewellery counters and liquor shops instead of cargo. Uphill, houses shrink and brighten corrugated tin roofs painted in reds and blues, not for decoration alone, but because bright colours and steep pitched roofs shed tropical downpours fast and reflect sun that would otherwise turn a house into an oven. Wooden gingerbread trim on older homes isn't just Caribbean charm. It's ventilation, cut in decorative patterns that let hot air escape without needing a single window air conditioner. What Charlotte Amalie doesn't have shapes it as much as what it does. There is no skyline of high rises, building codes and hillside terrain make that nearly impossible. There is no real winter, no seasonal closing of businesses, no snow days to plan around, and crime that would dominate headlines in a mainland city of similar size barely registers here as daily conversation. People leave car windows down and screen doors unlocked in a way that would seem careless anywhere else. The people who end up staying are a specific type: continentals who came for a 2-week vacation and never left. West Indian families whose roots on the island go back generations before the US flag ever flew here. Retirees drawn by the absence of federal income tax on island-earned income, and a rotating cast of boat captains, dive instructors, and bartenders who treat the whole Caribbean as a loose, shifting neighborhood. What holds them here isn't ease. Charlotte Amalie is, by any measure, an inconvenient place to live. It's the specific trade the island offers: give up flat ground and quick errands, and get back a harbour view from your kitchen window, and a slower, more physical relationship with your own front yard. The most consequential animal on St. Thomas was never native to it at all. In the 1880s, plantation owners across the Caribbean imported the small Indian mongoose by the boatload to hunt down rats destroying sugarcane fields. The mongoose did that job well, and then kept going, wiping out ground-nesting birds, lizards and snakes across the region in one of the most cited case studies in the science of invasive species. Today, the animal most likely to dart across a St. Thomas Road at dusk isn't a native creature at all, but a descendant of that 19th century import, a small, quick, permanent resident that outnumbers almost anything else moving through the underbrush. The waters tell a different story. Hawksbill and green sea turtles still haul themselves onto quiet beaches on the island's east end to lay eggs, a nesting ritual old enough that local conservation volunteers now walk the sand at dawn during nesting season to flag and protect the tracks before anyone can disturb them. Pelicans fold themselves into dives off the harbour breakwater. Iguanas the length of a human forearm sun themselves on stone walls in town, tolerated the way a neighbour's cat might be. Offshore, in winter and early spring, humpback whales pass through Caribbean waters on one of the animal kingdom's longest annual migrations. Thousands of miles between Atlantic feeding grounds and Caribbean breeding waters, visible on the right day, from a boat or even a headland. Beneath the surface, reef systems ring much of the island in the kind of dense, layered marine life that drew snorkel and dive operators here decades before mass tourism did. Parrotfish grazing coral in flashes of turquoise and violet, barracuda hanging motionless in the current, the occasional nurse shark tucked under a ledge, more curious than threatening. Coexistence on St. Thomas is not an abstract environmental talking point. It's a mongoose crossing a driveway, a turtle track cordoned off with string, and a hand-lettered sign, a fisherman timing his mooring around a whale he's spotted from shore. There is no river on St. Thomas, no lake, no reliable natural fresh water source of any kind. Every drop of water a household uses, for drinking, cooking, bathing, has historically come from the sky itself, caught on a rooftop and funneled into a cistern buried beneath or beside the house. For generations, island building codes required new homes to include a cistern sized to the roof that fed it. Because rain wasn't a weather event here, it was the entire water supply. The hardship in that arrangement is real and immediate. A dry stretch doesn't just mean dust and brown grass. It means checking the cistern gauge the way a mainland driver checks a gas tank, rationing showers, calling a water delivery truck if the tank runs low before the sky cooperates. Long-time residents learn to read clouds the way sailors read charts, which formation over which ridge means rain is coming, which afternoon haze means another dry week ahead. The adaptation runs just as deep into daily habit. Locals will tell you, almost as an aside, that they wash a car the week before rain is expected, not after. No point wasting cistern water on something the sky will handle for free. Desalination plants and municipal systems have supplemented household cisterns in recent decades. But the instinct hasn't disappeared. Even islanders with modern plumbing still keep an eye on their tank gauge, still feel a small private relief when a downpour fills it back up. And that relief, over time, becomes something closer to affection. Residents describe the sound of hard rain on a tin roof not as an inconvenience, but as one of the most comforting sounds on the island. A full-bodied drumming that means the tank is filling, the plants are drinking, the dry spell is over. At least for now, between the dry, dusty stretch of late winter and the heavier rains of late summer, sits a shorter transitional season locals sometimes just call the in-between, a run of days with unpredictable scattered showers, rainbows arcing over the harbour almost daily. The whole island caught in a kind of meteorological limbo before committing to one season or the other. There's a stretch of the calendar on St. Thomas that locals mark the way farmers elsewhere mark planting season. Not a single storm, but a months-long window, roughly June through November, when every household keeps one ear tuned to the tropics. Plywood panels get labelled and stacked in garages the way a mainland home might store holiday decorations, ready to go up over windows on a few hours' notice. Names of past storms get dropped into conversation the way other places reference a hard winter or a bad flood year. Hurricane Marilyn in 1995, Hurricane Lenny in 1999, and the catastrophic double blow of Irma and Maria in September 2017. Two major hurricanes crossing the island within 2 weeks of each other and stripping roofs, snapping utility poles, and knocking out power for months in some neighborhoods. The hardship of that season is not abstract to anyone who has lived through it. Losing power for weeks, watching a roof peel back like a lid, waiting days for a downed tree to be cleared from the only road to town, these are not hypothetical scenarios here, but shared, specific memories that entire neighborhoods can recount in the same breath. What softens that hardship is a set of habits built from repetition, generators tested every spring, cisterns topped off before the season starts, extended family arrangements made in advance for who shelters where if a storm tracks close. Out of that same season comes something residents describe almost proudly, a version of neighborliness that only shows up under pressure. Chainsaws get passed hand to hand down a street the morning after a storm, without anyone needing to ask. Generators run extension cords to a neighbor's refrigerator before their own freezer is secured. Church halls and school gyms open as informal shelters and supply points, staffed by whoever shows up first. Residents will say, without exaggeration, that they've learned more about who their neighbors really are during a single storm week than in years of ordinary calm. A shorter, quieter coda follows most storms in the weeks after, a run of unusually clear, dry, wind-scrubbed days that longtime islanders half-joke is the sky's way of apologizing, the calm that always seems to follow the worst of it. For nearly 3 centuries, St. Thomas has made its living from being a stopover rather than a destination in the old-fashioned sense. A place ships passed through on the way to somewhere else and often decided to linger. Under Danish rule, Charlotte Amalie's deep harbour became one of the busiest free ports in the Caribbean, a place where European, and later American, traders could exchange goods largely outside the tariff structures that governed neighbouring colonies. That legacy never fully left. The island still operates as a duty-free port today, which is precisely why cruise line jewellery counters and liquor shops dominate the old harbourfront warehouses. The island's global reach shows up in less obvious ways, too. Charlotte Amalie is the birthplace of the painter Camille Pissarro, who left the island as a young man and went on to become one of the founding figures of French Impressionism. Exhibiting alongside Monet and Degas in Paris, a direct, documented thread running from this small Caribbean harbour town to the walls of the world's great museums. What does it mean for a movement built on capturing shifting light and ordinary life to have one of its founders raised under Caribbean sun, on streets that still climb the same hills he once walked? What does it say about a place this size that it can produce a global cultural export and remain, in the same century, a footnote on most world maps? Today, roughly 2 million visitors pass through St. Thomas in a typical year, the overwhelming majority by cruise ship, making the island's relationship to the wider world less about export and more about welcome. Thousands of strangers disembarking each week into a town of a few thousand residents. A free port, a painter's birthplace, a harbour that has never really stopped receiving people from somewhere else. Every last weekend in March, the waters off St. Thomas's Cowpit Bay fill with sails from a dozen different countries. all here for the same reason: the International Rolex Regatta. Hosted continuously by the St. Thomas Yacht Club since 1974, making it the oldest event in Rolex's entire global portfolio of sailing sponsorships. What began as a small 3-day, 3-race gathering among sailors who happened to know each other has grown into a fixture on the international racing calendar, drawing crews and yachts from the Caribbean, the US, mainland, and Europe to compete through the cuts and quays east of the island. The club behind it has a global sailing pedigree well out of proportion to the island's size. The US Virgin Islands was accepted as its own Olympic sailing nation in the 1960s, and Stike sailors have gone on to Olympic medals and America's Cup campaigns, carrying the island's name into arenas most people would never associate with a 32-square-mile territory. The regatta itself has weathered its own share of disruption over the decades, cancelled outright the year Hurricane Marilyn struck, rescheduled the year Hurricane Lenny forced a delay into January, evidence that even the island's global sporting calendar bends to the same seasonal rhythms as everything else here. What makes the event distinctly of this place, rather than merely hosted by it, is the way competition and hospitality run together without much separation. Race committees on the water by 11 each morning, then reggae concerts and beach parties on St. Thomas Yacht Club's own shoreline by evening, sailors and locals mixing at the same tables. Longtime competitors describe returning year after year less for the trophies than for the specific. Reliable breeze and the particular brand of camaraderie the island offers, proof that a place this small can still, once a year, become one of the most closely watched patches of water in the sailing world. Ask most visitors what language they'd expect to hear on a Caribbean island flying the American flag, and French is rarely the answer. Yet on St. Thomas's western shore sits Frenchtown, a tight fishing community founded by refugees from the French Caribbean island of St. Barthélemy after a devastating 1867 hurricane drove many of its residents to seek safer ground. Their descendants, locally called Francie, built a village of small wooden houses and fishing boats that for generations operated almost as a world apart from the rest of St. Thomas, its own dialect, its own church, its own fleet, working the same waters their great-grandparents once fished. The juxtaposition is immediate and strange in the best way. A French Creole fishing culture, older than American ownership of the island itself, tucked a few minutes' drive from cruise ship crowds and duty-free jewelry stores, its narrow lanes lined with fishing nets drying next to seafood restaurants that now draw diners from across the island. Older Frenchtown residents still recall grandparents who spoke almost no English at all, conducting entire lives, church, marriage, mourning, inside a linguistic pocket that had nothing to do with the American territory technically surrounding it. That distinctiveness has thinned with each generation, as intermarriage, tourism, and outside development have pulled Frenchtown closer to the rest of the island's rhythm, and longtime families have voiced real, unresolved frustration about rising property costs, pricing out the descendants of the very people who built the neighborhood. It remains, depending on who you ask, either a living cultural pocket worth protecting or a fading memory being slowly absorbed. And St. Thomas, to its credit, doesn't pretend that tension has a tidy resolution. Late April brings a sound to Charlotte Amalie that has nothing to do with cruise ship announcements or harbour traffic. Steel pan and soca rolling down Main Street ahead of St. Thomas Carnival, the island's largest annual celebration. First held in 1912 under Danish rule and revived for good in the 1950s after decades of interruption. Costume troops, calypso competitions, and a lighted boat parade now fill the last days of April and 1st of May, turning the harbourfront into a single, days-long street party built around music, masquerade, and pageantry. Above the crowd, on stilts sometimes 10 feet tall, move the island's Moko Jumbies, costume performers whose towering, swaying figures have become one of the most recognizable images of Virgin Islands culture, appearing on the territory's own tourism branding. The tradition traces back to West African spiritual practice, where towering stilt figures were believed to watch over villages from above and ward off harm. It survived the Middle Passage carried by enslaved Africans, and on islands like this one, evolved from a private spiritual practice into public carnival performance. For decades, the art form nearly disappeared under colonial era suppression, kept alive only by a handful of dedicated performers and community groups who trained new generations of stilt walkers largely on their own initiative. That revival has since carried the tradition well beyond St. Thomas itself. Local troupes have travelled to perform at major Caribbean culture festivals in Canada and elsewhere, carrying the island's version of the art form to audiences who have never set foot on the island. Locally, the performers are treated as something closer to cultural guardians than entertainers. Children are taught the tradition's history alongside its choreography, and long-time residents will describe, half seriously, a Moko Jumbi's presence at a gathering as a kind of protection. Proof that a costume born out of centuries-old hardship can still be a genuine source of pride and continuity for the community that kept it alive. Every hillside on St. Thomas is, in the most literal sense, a volcano's leftover work. The island's ridges are the exposed, eroded remains of an undersea volcanic arc tens of millions of years old, later pushed and folded by the same tectonic forces that shaped the entire Lesser Antilles chain. Crown Mountain, the island's highest point at just over 1,500 feet, is built from that same ancient volcanic rock, old enough that nothing about its shape has anything to do with recent weather, and everything to do with a much longer story written in stone. That deep timeline predates any human presence by an almost incomprehensible margin. But people have been climbing these same slopes for a very long time, regardless. Archaeological evidence places the island's earliest known inhabitants, the Saboni, on St. Thomas roughly 3,000 years ago, followed over the centuries by Arawak and later Carib settlement. Communities that fished the same reefs, climbed the same ridgelines, and read the same sky long before any European ship reached these waters. The steep terrain that makes modern construction so difficult also dictated where those earliest settlements could take root, near flat coastal shelves, close to fresh rain catchment, within reach of a protected cove. The hills don't sit still, either, but their motion is geological, not alarming. Loose volcanic soil on the steepest slopes shifts and slides after the heaviest rains, the way it always has, forcing roads to be rebuilt and retaining walls to be reinforced in a maintenance cycle as old as settlement itself. Residents who've spent a lifetime on the island describe a specific, physical familiarity with these slopes, knowing by feel which switchback tightens unexpectedly, which retaining wall to trust after a storm, which ridge to watch for the exact moment the sun clears it each morning. It's a relationship with rock and grade, that a flatter place could never produce. The landscape isn't scenery here. It's memorized, the way a long-time resident of anywhere memorizes their own staircase in the dark. Almost everything a St. Thomas household eats arrives by boat. With minimal arable flat land and a climate not suited to large-scale farming, the island imports the overwhelming majority of its food from the US. Mainland and beyond, a supply chain vulnerable to shipping delays, storm closures, and the simple economics of shipping cargo to a small Caribbean market, which is part of why grocery prices here regularly run well above mainland US. Averages, that reality shapes something close to a permanent low-grade vigilance around stocking up. Residents talk about provisioning the way people elsewhere talk about running errands, buying in bulk when a supply ship comes in, rather than trusting that the same items will be on the shelf next week. Charlotte Amalie's main markets and supermarkets become, in that context, less like convenience stops and more like genuine planning hubs. The kind of place where a shopper checks not just price, but availability, because an out-of-stock item might stay out of stock for a while. Despite that fragility, the island's food culture runs surprisingly deep and specific. Fungi, a cornmeal and okra staple, pairs with saltfish in one of the island's defining traditional dishes. Kalaloo, a dense, savory stew built from leafy greens, okra, and whatever seafood or meat is on hand, varies from household to household the way a family recipe should. Johnny cake, fried, doughy, slightly sweet, shows up at breakfast tables and roadside stands alike. While malby, a fermented bark-based drink, and guava-brie liqueur round out flavors found nowhere on the mainland. Given the island's size and remoteness, its restaurant scene punches well above its weight. Waterfront kitchens in Frenchtown, and beyond turning fresh, court fish into dishes that draw comparisons to far larger culinary cities. A sophistication that surprises visitors who arrive expecting little beyond cruise terminal fast food. And when supply runs genuinely short, after a bad storm, a delayed cargo ship, a rough season, the response here has never been purely individual. Neighbors share from home gardens. Fishermen split a good catch informally down the dock. Church and community groups organize distribution for anyone caught short. On an island where the next grocery delivery is never fully guaranteed, eating well has always been treated less like a private transaction and more like a promise the whole community quietly keeps to itself. Living here means accepting things that would be deal breakers almost anywhere else. You check a cistern gauge the way other people check a bank balance. You pay noticeably more for groceries that arrived on a ship, not a truck. You climb stone staircases instead of driving to a neighbor's house. And you plan your week around whether a hurricane might reroute it entirely. And yet, the people who choose to stay on St. Thomas rarely speak of any of that as hardship. They speak of the harbour light at 6 in the evening. They speak of rain on a tin roof. They speak of a hillside they know so well they could walk it blind. Something shifts in a person who spends enough years on ground this steep and this small. Time slows to the pace of a ferry schedule instead of a commute. Attention sharpens toward things a flatter, easier place would never demand you notice. Cloud shapes, tide lines, the particular creak of a staircase you've climbed 10,000 times. What gets called inconvenience from the outside gets called simply how you live from the inside, and the difference between those two framings is most of what this place has to teach. The small, self-selected community that ends up staying, West Indian families generations deep, Danish-era descendants, French Creole fishing families, continentals who meant to leave after 2 weeks, proves something simple about belonging. It isn't handed out by geography or convenience. It's built, slowly, by people willing to trade an easier life for a more specific one. Up on Synagogue Hill, the sand floor of that small 1833 building is still swept smooth, still standing after fire took its predecessors 3 separate times. A quiet, physical reminder that on an island this exposed to loss, what survives here does so because a whole community decided, together, that it should. St. Thomas doesn't need to convince anyone to stay. The people who belong here already know it. The way they know which staircase shortcuts which road, which cloud, means rain by evening.